Well, welcome everybody. It is the somewhat magical time of 1 minute past the appointed hour. And so I will begin this second of our series of critical conversations sponsored by the Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. My name is Adele, and I am a settler historian here at the University of Manitoba, and I'm also the director of the Center for Human Rights Research. Since 2012, the center has held an annual public seminar series. Early in the pandemic, we moved online, and for the time being, staying in this digital space seems a good way to reach beyond our usual geographies and also to welcome different speakers and audiences. But even when we're working digitally, we do so from a particular place and with particular responsibilities and relationships to it. The University of Manitoba's Fort Garry campus, which is where we are located on right now, are located in Anishinaabe, Innu, and Red River Métis lands and waters, and marked by the relationships and obligations of Treaty 1, the first of Canada's numbered treaties, and also of the Manitoba Act. We are always connected to our relations to the north and to the west by the fact that hydroelectric power that runs our laptops and lights our rooms comes from Innu territories in Treaty 5. And we are connected by our relations to the east by the fact that Shoal Lake water has flowed in Winnipeg taps for more than 100 years. So we are all walking around some 2/3 Shoal Lake water. This year's Critical Conversation series focuses on borders as part of the CHRR's new theme on borders and human rights. If you were lucky enough to join us for our first Critical Conversations event, a conversation on borders, colonialism, and resistance, featuring thinkers and activists Dr. Alex Wilson and Harsha Walia on the 17th of February, you'll know that we are imagining the theme of borders and human rights in ways that are simultaneously capacious, critical, and gender, and have Indigenous ontologies and sovereignties and anti-racism always in mind. Today's event brings this thinking around borders in conversation with waters. The CHRR has long been concerned with water as a human right and an Indigenous right, something addressed by Canadian law, by treaty law, and by international human rights mechanisms, and yet something that remains too often unavailable, most notably for First Nations on reserve in Canada. In the last years, we have been a part of the University of Manitoba's United Nations Academic Impact Hub for Sustainable Development Goal 6, which is to, and I quote, ensure available and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Today's event is co-sponsored by that group, the UNA SDG 6, which will also be sending or be part of a delegation being sent to the UN's water conference in New York later this month. Today's panel will engage the confluence of water and borders in a number of ways. Does water have a border? When do the politics of water cut across borders, and when are they shaped or even determined by them? How does water challenge our conventional understanding of borders, including geopolitical ones? And how does it alert us to histories that predate the powers of the colonial state? Can struggles around water, whether for decent drinking water or against mega projects and their impacts on Indigenous communities on different sides of North America's settler borders, be understood in common or as discrete and different? When is water a border, and when does it challenge those borders? We have 4 really remarkably accomplished speakers with expertise in a range of disciplines and different North American geographies to engage these questions. I am going to introduce them in turn, and then each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. We will then have some time for the speakers to address each other's. And then we will have some time remaining to engage questions that were submitted during the registration process, or which you might also submit in the Q&A function. And Dr. Pauline Tennant from the center and myself will be monitoring those questions. We have also been joined by Christina Morden and Shannon Hokanson, who are doing American Sign Language interpretation. And they are from the University of Manitoba Student Accessibility Services. Dr. Norman, who I'm going to introduce shortly, is going to have to leave our call a little bit on the earlier side, but we can follow up with her and through all the other technologies that we have available to us, including by email. So with that, I will begin by introducing Dr. Emma Norman, who is the Department Chair of Native Environmental Science Program at Northwestern Indian College in Bellingham, Washington, where she has been since 2002. She works alongside and with Indigenous communities to increase diversity in the sciences and open up space for multiple ways of knowing. Her writing and teaching engage with critical geographies of space, specifically decolonizing borderlands and Indigenous water governance. She is the author of Governing Transboundary Water, Canada, the United States, and Indigenous Communities, and also co-editor of Water Without Borders, Canada, the United States, and Shared Waters, and Negotiating Water Governance, Why the Politics of Scale Matter. After that, I'll introduce Dr. Teresa Montoya, is a social scientist who focuses on contemporary problems of toxic contamination in relationship to historical legacies of land dispossession and resource extraction across the Indigenous Southwest. Her current manuscript project, Preamble, Diné Politics of Extraction and Exposure, draws upon ethnography and oral history to analyze ongoing environmental and legal impacts for Diné communities following the 1979 Church Rock uranium spill and the 2015 Gold King mine spill across the Navajo Nation. Her broader research interests include tribal jurisdiction and sovereignty around environmental issues, water justice, and water governance of the Colorado River. She is assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago and a citizen of the Navajo Nation. Dr. Nicole Wilson is a scholar of settler origins whose research examines Indigenous relationships with water and water governance in the context of colonialism and environmental change. She is an assistant professor of Canada Research Chair in Arctic Environmental Change and Governance in the Department of Environment and Geography and the Center for Earth Observational Science here at the University of Manitoba. She is also the co-chair of the United Nations Academic Impact Hub for Sustainable Development Goal 6 on clean water and sanitation. So with those introductions, I will pass things over to Dr. Norman. We need to unmute Emma.
Oh, thank you. I'll start over. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the invitation to join this group and the warm introduction. It's really important to have these conversations, particularly geographically and also through the connection of water. I just wanted to first acknowledge that I'm zooming in from, and my feet are on the traditional territory of the Laktamish peoples. I've been working alongside and with the Lummi community, as well as the Nooksack and other Coast Salish tribes for the last 20 years as an ally and as a guest. The work that I do at Northwest Indian College is within the Native Environmental Science program as a department chair, working to grow that program, one of the largest Native Environmental Science programs in North America. On the academic side of the work that I do, and I make a nod to University of British Columbia, where that's where I know Dr. Wilson. We've been able to visit get to know our work through different geographies, but my PhD training was in UBC. But meanwhile, I stayed and worked within the traditional territory of the Laktamish people. So I really was embodied borderlands, living in the United States, working in Lummi Nation, and going to graduate school up in UBC. So that was a really wonderful, interesting period of my life. So I'm going to go ahead and start this slideshow. Let's see. Okay, I think you can see it now. And so when I think about bordered waters and really the critical conversations of water and borders, as a geographer, for one of the first things I like to do is, go in and out of different scales and geographies. And so, of course, the big blue marble of our Earth is well known throughout the universe of being a sustainer of life. But what does that look like when we zoom down to our different geographies and our different waterscapes and the sacred waters and obligations of the work that we do. And I have here the Nooksack River, which is the watershed under which I live, and I cross the river every day as I go on and off work to Northwest Indian College. This particular geography is a local bay, Chuckanut Bay, right within walking distance of our home community. And then also I want to recognize this canoe from a canoe journey up in Bella Bella, coming down cross borders for canoe journey. And so all of these connectors of water go right into the idea of a fluid geography of water, but also a complex geopolitical landscape. And what does that mean in terms of the idyllic big blue water earth that we have? But then we look at the history of the usage and misuse, not only of water, but the impacts of that on an industrial nation. You see oil tankers, which are not too far out throughout the Salish Sea, not too far from where I'm perched. You'll go out and see these huge oil tankers in areas that are pristine ecosystems and water marine systems. And you also recognize that on the beaches, what really plentiful shellfish harvesting areas that are important and brought into the treaties of the tribes and First Nations of the Coast Salish territory have now been injured because of PCBs, upstream pollution, etc. So the pollution of waters are impacting not only the health of the ecosystems, but impacting the rights of Indigenous nations and the well-being of all of its citizens, and is a direct treaty violation for those that signed that, in particular in the territory that I'm living and working in, the 1855 Point Elliott Treaty. And so when you scale then back to the idea of the earth and water, it's really the question is, water is a local resource, yet part of a global system, perhaps more than anything else. But then the other thing is to reframe that. Is water a resource? Or if we reframe it as water is a gift from the creator that requires responsibilities for each individual and community to protect. And so I really want to think about that as an entry point, and I'm sure that my colleagues in the other panels will pick that up in terms of that different perspective of water as a utility, or water from a spiritual, cultural connection, which is a very different starting point. But it also, in terms of a management regime, it comes in different forms. It comes in freshwater, rainwater, glaciers, urban streams, supporting recreation, supporting mammals, food sources. And so not only when you think about bordered and bordered spaces, it's a slippery resource, and also the aquifers itself, for those that are getting their water from aquifers, may not know exactly where they are. And so when you think about water and borders, you also have to think about the different forms that they come in. And then also really recognize the bordered spaces have different political geographies and different geographies of passage. So for those of going across a border may be relatively smooth if you have a nexus pass, or you have a profile, so to speak, that is not something that will trigger an alert. And other ways, there are bordered spaces that are very, very difficult to pass. And so recognizing that borders and waters are not equal in terms of the passage and the ability to govern. And then also I want to recognize the historic context of borders. I'm going to go to this and then go back to that side of the Columbia River Treaty, is that the political borders are socially constructed, and they're new, very, very new. And so when we're talking about the treaties and the drawing and the scripting of lines, I really like to think about how that is then reinforced not only through policed lines through bordered spaces, as you saw in the image prior, but also in educational programming as students and youth are programmed to identify themselves with a particular space, whether that be carved up in Canada or carved down in the United States and their particular state and then a city. So all of this identity building then is all wrapped up in border politics. And also recognizing that border politics are new, thinking about particularly the Coast Salish territory, the British-American boundary of 1846 and the territory and all of the negotiations that happened outside of the work of the traditional territories of First Nations and Indigenous peoples throughout North America. And so one of the things that I really wanted to home in on is this image of the Columbia River Treaty, the signing, which is up for renegotiation right now, which is a really important thing for us to pay attention to, because when the Columbia River Treaty, which is a transboundary treaty, was first negotiated, it did not include Indigenous representation. And so now we're up for renegotiation, and there's been a concerted effort for inclusion. But again, the locus of power still lies in Ottawa and Washington, D.C. So it's a really important thing for us to pay attention to, is the structural legacies of legal documents that are already steeped in bias, of power, that those live on through our laws and regulations. And it's important for us not to be complacent, and to really recognize that it's an ongoing work to decolonize, to rethink our relationship with water and borders. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for the time, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Norman, for giving us such a window into these questions and the particular kind of geographies where you are kind of most located and engaged with, but for, I think, setting a bunch of questions, including around brittle legal documents, and including around the kind of the tensions between the local and the global senses of water that I think we'll come back to in one way or another. So thank you for getting us going in such a great way. I will now pass things over to Dr. Montoya.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Perry and Dr. Norman. I'll also share my screen, a few slides here. Okay, is this working for everyone now? Yeah, I'll just reference a bit of my research. As stated in the introduction, I'm Dene from the Navajo Nation, which is in the Indigenous Southwest of the United States. The Navajo Nation extends across multiple state borders. So it's 27,000 square miles across the current states of Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. My family is in Window Rock, Arizona, which is the capital of the Navajo Nation. And I became interested in these issues because of this notification of uranium contamination in a community that my grandfather grew up in, which is Sanders, in Sanders, Arizona. And I did not know, as many participants and members of this community didn't know, that there was still lingering effects of this toxic contamination that were lingering from the 1979 Church Rock spill. This is in Church Rock, New Mexico, which is the site of the largest release in radiation history in the US till this day. Over 93 million gallons of uranium-laden water was discharged from this uranium mill tailing site. So this is just an Associated Press photograph warning residents that the water in this arroyo is contaminated. I'm also interested in the legacy of other forms of contamination. So this is a sign outside of the Department of Energy site near Shiprock, New Mexico. You can see the iconic rock feature actually featured in the blurred background of this photograph. And once again, another sign written in both English and Dene Bazad, Navajo language, warning residents about the dangers of this former uranium site. So uranium had been extensively mined across the Navajo Nation during the Cold War era, so starting from the 40s all the way through the 70s. The Navajo Nation currently has a moratorium on uranium mining, but that has not stopped the ongoing discharge of contaminants across and between our homelands. So this map put together by the EPA shows over 500 abandoned uranium mines that are present on the Navajo Nation. The arrows indicate the photographs I just showed you. So the Department of Energy Legacy Disposal Site, Shiprock, the Church Rock Spill Source Point, which is located on what is called a checkerboard allotment land just north of Gallup, New Mexico, and then Sanders Community, which is downstream from Church Rock, which is where I focus a lot of my research with community members. Across the Navajo Nation, even in places that are not adjacent to these well-known spills, also have high levels of uranium contamination. So this well here, a livestock well, artists, artfully painted graffiti on it to indicate that the water in this well is found to be above the US EPA limits for drinking water standards due to uranium contamination. And because the Navajo Nation does not have widespread water infrastructure, estimates of up to 40% of Navajo households don't have indoor plumbing and thus rely on unregulated water sources such as this one, not only for livestock watering, but also for household use, or they will drive to border towns in order to buy bottled water. So this is, water insecurity is a huge issue across the Navajo Nation, which is exacerbated in my research, through these imposed borders. Oh, it's not letting me go to the next image. Okay. So in particular, a case study that I'm trying to draw out in terms of this longer legacy of imposed borders, which is the imposition of the demarcation of the current geopolitical boundaries of the Navajo Reservation, which does not include any of our sacred mountains, which is the way that we imagined our ancestral homelands. So on this map, you can see those 4 mountains designated. So Hesperus and Blanca are the English names for our sacred mountains in Colorado, and Mount Taylor, New Mexico, and San Francisco Peaks outside of Flagstaff. So that actually gives you the broadest sense of what we imagine to be our homelands. And thus even the current geopolitical boundaries of the Navajo Nation, which is the largest reservation land base in the United States, is still vastly smaller than our original homelands. And because of the legacy of allotment, particularly in New Mexico and along the southern region of the Navajo Nation, as indicated by the arrow where I called it the Island of Sanders, I look historically at railroad allotment records and archives and oral history with family members who were dispossessed by the arrival of the railroad in the late 1890s through this region, which roughly follows the path of the current I-40 freeway, which you can kind of see on gray in this map. So because of those land deals at the turn of the 20th century, many Navajo families, were dispossessed of their land. And even though the Navajo Nation was able to regain some of that territory over the course of the 20th century, which you can see indicated on the map, all of those dates refer to when we were able to get concessions from the government to basically restore parts of our homeland, which is a unique story compared to many other tribes who weren't able to gain as much of their territory back. In any case, some of these land parcels were not able to be restored. So across the Navajo Nation, you basically have a checkerboard quilt, despite what this homogeneous map indicates. And Sanders is one of those communities. So it's essentially 3 square mile island of land that is not within current Navajo jurisdiction. So this makes things like the regulation of alcohol sales. Navajo Nation is dry, but until a few years ago, a liquor store took advantage of that jurisdictional loophole and was able to operate legally in this island. And in my research, also looking at, the ongoing impacts of water contamination has made remediation very difficult, because in this community, Navajo Nation EPA does not have regulatory authority. So, the imposition of these borders of settler jurisdictions have made, environmental regulation that much more difficult, especially for a nation, that does have its own environmental standards, that either meet or exceed even federal EPA standards. And this is just an image of Klachit as Ahe, which actually refers to the red butte on the horizon. This is a seasonal arroyo, and this is the area that was flooded from the church rock uranium spill. And you can see, at certain times of the year, especially in the summer, we have, seasonal rains, that water will flow through here once again. But of course, that carries with it, a traumatic reminder of that spill that happened over 40 years ago. Let's see. And I will just talk very briefly about the Gold King mine spill, which is another case study that I look at in my manuscript. So this is another example of the fragility of these settler boundaries and how contamination reminds us that these that water and contaminated water transcends these boundaries. So Gold King mine is a dilapidated mine that was formed in the early 20th century. So the San Juan Mountains of Colorado are site of rampant gold extraction throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. So Gold King mine hadn't been in operation for many years, and back in 2015, an EPA subcontractor was sent to the site basically to fix a mine adit that they were worried would soon fail, which through this project, they actually inadvertently did cause it to fail that much sooner, and communities were not prepared for this. Silverton, which is a mining community located just south of the mine, I would say had the most visible or most potent yellow water, as indicated by this map. But they were more used to seeing this metal-laden water. There's a lot of heavy metals, rust and iron. So literally the river turned a mustard color. But because of the ongoing discharge of mines in the region, that anytime there was a heavy rain, it would actually stir up the sediment. And so residents were actually quite accustomed to seeing the changing color of the river, which was very disturbing and surprising to me. So as you head down south, the Animas River crosses the Colorado and New Mexico border. And when it proceeds to Farmington, it links with the confluence of the San Juan River, which is a sacred male entity, to Dene, and that's when it enters the Navajo Nation. The Shiprock is that community that I showed at the beginning of this presentation with that Department of Energy site. The uranium tailings and mills had operated there for many years. So when the river turned orange, many of the Dene residents, had to relive, the traumatic memories of other former contaminants like uranium because of this, ongoing problem of uranium extraction. So, the color yellow indexes different forms of toxic legacies. And, the Shiprock and all of these communities are really at the heart of the Navajo agricultural industry. So for over a year after that spill, Dene communities shut off their intake valves and did not irrigate. So they lost, income from agriculture. And more than that, the river has many cultural and ceremonial purposes, which I will not describe here, but just to say that these sorts of activities exceed what the EPA regulatory guidelines imagine to be for a water user. So I'll just say, for instance, that the way that the water is regulated on the Animas River and the San Juan River imagines a recreational user. So they're not regulating for drinking water, which of course would have more stringent standards. But the assumption is that someone would presumably have indoor running water, that they wouldn't be relying on the water for drinking water purposes or for agricultural purposes, that their only interaction with the river would be through recreation, such as fishing or kayaking, which is actually much more typical of a resident, say, in Durango, Colorado, or Silverton, Colorado. So you could see how certain cultural assumptions are built into our regulatory systems. Because of the problem of jurisdiction that I had outlined in that other map, even places where a lot of Dene residents live, the land that they live on may or may not actually fall under the jurisdiction of the Navajo Nation. So I'll just end it there, but I just wanted to put forward, these other ideas and complications around borders, settler borders, county borders, state borders, and how that bears on tribal nations' ability to protect its land, environment, and people.
Thank you very much for a really powerful kind of window into the way these questions of water and borders come to rest. In a particular Indigenous territory that actually has a great deal of resonance with some of the kind of issues that are kind of particular to the context of Manitoba. And we've already got one question in on the chat that speaks directly to that, and we can come back to that later. But in the meantime, I'll just thank Professor Montoya for that really powerful discussion. And I will turn things over to Dr. Wilson to hear from her.
Hi there, just checking to see if you can see my notes there. Okay. My name is Nicole Wilson. As was mentioned, I'm a scholar of settler origin here at the University of Manitoba. And I'm actually a settler from Treaty 7 territory. And today I'm going to be sharing some of my work from Alaska and Yukon and British Columbia in the Yukon River watershed. A lot of my work centers around ideas related to Indigenous water governance, related to Indigenous approaches to decision-making about water. And while Indigenous peoples have been excluded by, historical and ongoing colonialism from settler water governance frameworks, Indigenous water governance works based on the assumption that Indigenous peoples have inherent water rights, responsibilities, and authorities that flow from these systems of governance and relationships with water as a relative. And as was mentioned before by my co-panelists, this idea that water is considered much more than just a material substance as we would think about it in kind of Western kind of colonial understandings, but as a living entity and something that needs to be respected. And as a result, very different understandings of governance flow from that. So I've been working in the Yukon River watershed or basin since about 2009. I originally just was looking for a master's thesis project and contacted one of the former directors of this Watershed Council, which is an intertribal organization made up of currently, I think, 75 Alaska Native tribes and First Nations from Yukon and British Columbia. That's been operating, I think, since about 2009. And they do a variety of things, including conduct something called the Indigenous Observation Network, which is a basin-wide Indigenous-led water quality monitoring network. And so you can see here the watershed spans the international border between Yukon and Alaska, the Canada-US border there, and as well, also importantly, this border between Yukon and British Columbia. I conducted my research in partnership with Ruby Tribal Council in the village of Ruby, Alaska. And that was kind of my first introduction to thinking about Indigenous relationships to water. And continuing through that work, began to do some work in Yukon prior to my PhD with a number of Yukon First Nations that led to a PhD project looking at modern land claim agreements and the way that they shape water governance in Yukon. Carcross-Tagish First Nation was one of my partners on my PhD research, and I've continued to work with them since 2012. And so another border that has been very prominent in my research is this Yukon BC border. I should say, you know, in this context, tribes and First Nations are collaborating, you know, across this border to look at kind of common concerns related to climate change, mining, the protection of salmon habitat, and very much you know, transcending the border in this context, despite its imposition. Carcross-Tagish First Nation, as I mentioned, I've been working with them since 2012 with a number of very knowledgeable citizens of the nation, including Colleen James and Coralie Johns, who are pictured there. Here you can see a map of their traditional territory up close on the Southern Lakes in Yukon and British Columbia. There's a lot I could say about the work that we've been doing together over the years, but when we're thinking about water and borders, I think it's fairly obvious how their territory is bisected by this intra-national border between the territory and province. And this has consequences for the way that the First Nation is able to protect the waters within their territory. For example, in Yukon, they have a modern treaty or their final agreement, as well as a self-government agreement that has various provisions related to water, including a whole chapter on water management and very strong language related to the right to unaltered water quality, quantity, and rate of flow. In British Columbia, they have unceded territory where, they retain title to all of the lands within that context. Again, in Yukon, you have the Yukon Waters Act, and British Columbia, you have the BC Water Sustainability Act. So these are just a couple of examples of the differences that the First Nation is navigating in their efforts to try to, as we work to revitalize their Tagish and Tlingit legal order and relationships to water in order to protect it. In kind of thinking about this, I wanted to share a little bit about CTFN's approach and the work that we've been doing, and this idea that, you know, in revitalizing Indigenous kind of legal orders, Tagish and Tlingit laws related to water. The late Stanley James from the Ducklewiti clan shared with me in 2012 that the laws we have for water are in the clan houses. Those kinds of things are important because we need to know, we need to respect water. And so this idea that if we want to know how to protect water, then we need to look to the clan houses, and this is reflected in all of CTFN's governing bodies, including the water committee that was created in 2019. With which I have been collaborating to try to develop a water strategy. You can see Colleen James facilitating a workshop in 2019 with all representatives of all 6 of the clans. And so I share this because this is part of an ongoing effort of the First Nations to develop a consistent approach throughout their territory, as well as, you know, in collaboration with other First Nations that have overlapping territories. And so when I'm thinking about why borders matter, you know, it was already mentioned by one of my co-panelists that borders are socially constructed. In this case, they are imposed by settler colonial regimes. And we need to think about borders in terms of not just being these fixed or static lines. I think we sort of take them for granted as settlers who think in very short time spans, but we need to think, as Harsha Walia says, about how they are productive regimes generated by and producing social relations of dominance. So they continue to have consequences today. In particular, thinking about how they create this jurisdictional complexity in the water governance landscape, where First Nations are already my First Nation partners, including CTFN, are already navigating very complex landscapes when their territories aren't bisected, by borders. I think thinking about the labor involved in just trying to navigate these two regimes in a manner that is in accordance with their kind of relationships to water and value to protect water. And so I thought, just to end in terms of thinking about, what is it we should be focusing on in terms of future research and in thinking about borders in ways that are productive and in support of Indigenous people's visions for their territories. And so from the context I've been working in, this is actually just a picture of the Yukon River at a place called The Bridge in Alaska. And I think I took this picture in 2010, one of my first times visiting the bridge, and it's one of the sample sites for the Indigenous Observation Network, the basin-wide water quality monitoring network that I mentioned. And so that's in Alaska. And so in thinking about Indigenous self-determination across borders, in kind of transcending and refusing those borders, what kinds of strategies are Indigenous peoples using? So part of my work has looked at this Indigenous Observation Network as an Indigenous-led example of community-based water monitoring, as the assertion of Indigenous governance across international and intranational borders, in terms of just imagine, projecting kind of that understanding of their territories as not being limited by these borders and water kind of not understanding those borders either. Finally, I think thinking about what it is colonial governments need to do to advance reconciliation, to advance kind of reconciliation in water governance in Canada, thinking about developing consistent and Indigenous-led approaches to decision-making about water across borders. And in this context, I'm particularly thinking about Yukon and British Columbia. So thank you so much for including me on this panel, and I look forward to discussing with my co-panelists.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson. That was 3 really remarkable kind of windows into the way that water and borders both kind of come together, cut across each other, and kind of produce different sorts of lived and possible realities in each of these contexts. I've just noted that we've just been joined on the call by Dr. Cary Miller. And I will just briefly introduce Dr. Miller, who has come to us from another meeting, called away, but we are grateful that she's been able to join us. Dr. Cary Miller is a 60s scoop survivor, is Anishinaabe, and descends from St. Croix and Leech Lake communities in Wisconsin and Minnesota. In 2017, she made the move to Winnipeg as the head of the Department of Indigenous Studies, and she now serves as the Associate Vice President in Indigenous with the profile of scholarship, research, and curriculum. Her book, Ogama, Anishinaabe Leadership, 1760 to 1845, which is a great book. It was published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2010. And she is one of the editors of a new edition of Indigenous Peoples Within Canada textbook from Oxford Press. Her research concerns Anishinaabe leadership in the early 19th century in the Great Lakes region, and she's particularly interested also in Anishinaabe women's history, treaty and sovereignty, Wisconsin Indian history, and in 18th and 19th century transborder North American Indigenous histories that center narratives of sovereign Indigenous land use, kinship, and diplomacy. And so we welcome Dr. Miller to this conversation, and I'll pass things over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. It's kind of hard to jump in the middle when I haven't heard what's gone on before. But I believe my role here was primarily to talk about, our historical sense of water, and our kind of our concerns and treaty rights and responsibilities with respect to water. So, historically, our communities here in the Great Lakes considered a water to be kind of a part of their community territories. And Europeans, as they arrived, considered them to be, sort of international free trade zones. Now, Indigenous people had been trading up and down along the rivers and through the lakes. We had trade routes that extended coast to coast and north to south across North America. We traded extensively in agricultural goods, among other things, such as copper, mica, shells, and various things that people needed. But the extent of agriculture, the water needs for that agriculture, and the water use for traverse and trade was very important. And as you traveled through the territory of other communities, you gave them gifts for the right to passage through those areas as you traveled. And these are things that Europeans didn't always understand, that often led to conflict and difficulty. When we think about water, and when we look at what communities reserved in their treaties, reserving rights to hunt, fish, and gather, these are treaty rights that we're looking at an assumption of continued access to fisheries, to the places where fish hatched, where fish run. We had systems of weirs that had actually allowed for almost a agricultural approach to managing fish populations. And as Europeans came in, and as Europeans began to apply the treaty system, Indigenous people assumed that they would continue to have free access to the waterways, but increasingly what the government imposed was a 2-chain allowance in from the shorelines. And this made it very difficult for Indigenous people to continue to practice their modes of agriculture, particularly when we look at things like wild rice. Wild rice is an incredible plant. In some ways, it's a misnomer to call it wild. In our language, it's monomen, the good berry, and it's something that absolutely was cultivated and tended and cared for. Wild rice is one of the most nutritious grains that is out there. It's very high in protein, it's very high in iron, and it's very high in a number of other vitamins and minerals that are very important for winter survival. And so the wild rice became a very important harvestable both for Indigenous people as well as for European arrivals. But the wild rice itself, as it's cultivated, it requires a very soft mud layer at the bottom that is easily disturbed. And the wild rice plant needs to have water that is low enough in the spring that the water can get, or the light can get through the water to germinate the seeds, but is high enough in the fall in order to support the plants so that they don't fall over. So periods of flood and periods of drought strongly affect the yields on a wild rice stand. And also introducing outboard motors, recreational vehicles, these will completely destroy the kind of bottom that you need in a lake or shallows of a river in order for wild rice to grow well. And the number of wild rice lakes that have been destroyed in the Great Lakes area due either to hydroelectric expansion and the flooding that accompanies that, or due to simply turning lakes into recreational areas surrounded by cabins with folks that have boats and outboard motors, really destroyed a significant amount of that ability to subsist. And when we look at it as agricultural productivity, there is a whole process that goes into harvesting and processing the rice. back in the 19th century and earlier, when we still had enormous numbers of birds, passenger pigeon, which is now extinct, for example. The descriptions in the historical record talk about flocks of birds in the early fall, so large they would darken the sky. And they talk about Indigenous people setting up nets between trees, literally to be able to catch birds in these very dense flocks. So the concern about bird predation on wild rice was very significant. And in about July, the women would go to the wild rice areas, would bind the rice in order to protect those seeds, both from bird predation, but also from any early fall storms that might hit. And binding the rice is bringing together multiple stalks, binding it with the inner bark of a basswood tree known as weegub. And then it also actually makes it much easier to harvest later in the year. So then you keep checking back on it to ensure that it's ripe. You can tell when it's ripe because it starts to turn from a bright green to a darker color around the seed heads. And then folks go out and instead of using even paddles, the practice was to use a pole with an antler attached to the end of it. Today, there's a very elaborate metal duckbill that you can get that goes in the water, disturbing very little, opens when it hits the bottom, then closes and slides out. So all of this being technology to provide as little disturbance to that precious mud layer at the bottom as possible. So pulling through the rice, knocking the rice from the stalks into the canoe, then taking that ashore, drying it, then putting it before a low fire and parching it. After parching it, it would actually be threshed by dancing on it, which included cultural songs, cultural dance steps. And then finally winnowing that rice by putting it into baskets and shaking it to allow the chaff to blow away. So those water resources, the agriculture that's involved are very significant. And we do have a question here about hemp culture as a water efficient crop with countless uses. And I guess my answer to that is, my deep dive into agriculture has primarily been around the Great Lakes and a little bit into perhaps the Ohio region. In those regions, I've not seen significant evidence of hemp cultivation. Cultivation really did focus on what were known as the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, but also quinoa. And when we look at the trade networks that were exchanging these plants, we found quinoa in about the Interlake region of Manitoba, about midway north in our province, that is genetically matched to archaeological sites in Ohio, where we think it was originally grown. So the trade is taking food long distances. We used nettle fiber. We used the inner bark of basswood tree. We used spruce root, which is a really incredible material to use for sewing and is what we preferred for sewing canoes. But I haven't come across references to using hemp and hemp plants in that way. And whether that's regional, maybe there are other areas of the nation where, or the continent where that was more common, but it hasn't come up in the sources that I've been investigating, fur trade sources, ethnographic sources, and oral sources for plant use. So the wild rice becomes enormously important, and as we selected our reserve spaces, we find that many communities, particularly in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and even in Ontario, were selecting areas where they had their wild rice beds. And so as hydroelectric companies came in and flooded them, Fond du Lac, for example, in Wisconsin is set in an area where they had about 4 or 5 wild rice lakes connected with streams that about 100 years ago, Northern States Power completely flooded. And so, you know, there are so many levels to that. There's the level of the fact that as the location of their historic town site and burial grounds, that became flooded and is an enormous cultural loss and a continued source of trauma, because periodically bodies are washed up from that flooding. The wild rice was gone, creating a greater dependency among communities. And, you know, what happened for them is that when the lease came up, they were able to renegotiate it in the 90s, and they now actually receive part of the financial benefit of the hydroelectric production. So it does not replace the wild rice, but at least it brings the community into a position in which they're deriving some benefit rather than 100% exploitation. And it would be good to see more agreements like that that are bringing revenues back to community. But this also goes to things like the right to fish in the Great Lakes. Lake Superior in particular has a number of areas that are renowned for salmon, whitefish, and other wonderful fish that we like to bring to our tables. The rapids at Sault Ste. Marie were, before the locks had been built, they never froze because the water was moving so fast. It's something like a 7-foot drop, if I remember correctly, from the basic water table of Lake Superior to that of Lakes Huron in Michigan. So the rapids there run fairly swiftly, and they become a really important spawning ground and a really important fishing location. You know, we have drawings from the Codex Canadiensis in the 1600s that show our communities out there in canoes spearfishing. And we have postcards from the very early 20th century, before most of the locks went in, of Indigenous people now wearing 20th century clothing, but still out there in their canoes in those rapids spearfishing. Because those rapids didn't close and remained such an incredible fishery, at the time of European arrival, it was supporting year-round a community of about 800 to 1,000 people who did not have to engage in much migration, and was a major gathering point for our communities. So access to these fisheries has continued to be very important, and communities from that region engaged in lawsuits to have continued access, not just to fish, but to fish commercially. And, you know, historically, there is significant justification for this, because Indigenous people, of course, were engaging in harvesting surpluses for trade amongst other communities, but also were significantly harvesting excess produce to trade with fur traders. And there's a number of examples of this, but I want to sort of give you this basic conception. If you are, you know, a fur trade person, and you've got a certain number of canoes in your brigade, and you are going to be traveling from Montreal back into the interior with your brigade of maybe, you know, 20, 25 canoes, and all of the people that have to paddle those canoes, do you really want to be filling them with all of the food that all of those people need to eat? Or do you want to fill them with all of the things that you can bring to trade? And so when you look at fur trade registers, you actually find that about 1/3 of trades are for food produced by Indigenous people agriculturally through excess surplus of wild rice, of corn, of dried berries, of maple sugar, and of fish. as well as deer meat. So this is a really significant point of exchange. It's a really significant use of water. And, in particular, when we talk about maple sugar, we refer to that sap in our language as sweet water. So there's a recognition that this is also a liquid nourishment, a relation to our water tables. The maple sugar is important because it's the first harvest of the spring. It's the first harvest after the long winter. And it's a harvest that provides very high energy food. But back in the day, we weren't trading internationally for things like cinnamon and black pepper. What we often flavored our food with was maple sugar, berries. So our foods almost had a sweet rather than a savory edge. But the discussions of the amount of sugar produced for trade really demonstrate a full industry. There are records from one community in Upper Michigan in the early 19th century indicating that they were shipping 25,000 pounds of maple sugar east. It was in high demand in the east because abolitionists were buying sugar made by free Indigenous people in preference to cane sugar produced by enslaved African Americans at the time. And the Métis families had figured out a method of straining the sugar using egg whites in order to whiten the sugar and make it look the same as the cane sugar that could be produced from the South. So the maple sugar is something that really engaged our communities in some ways in a global market, certainly in a international hemispheric market, and is one where we see all of this production. Going back to the rice, if we look at the writings of Alexander Henry the Younger, as he came through in 1763, he talks about trying to purchase rice for the support of the fur trading business that he's with. They go into a community in northern Minnesota. They first trade with the men. They've just come back from Montreal. They've been away all summer. They have all the new goods. The men trade with them and even get some things on, on account. And then the men step back and the women go forward. And the women were selling their wild rice. And he talks about buying 100 bushels of surplus from this single community in northern Minnesota. And that's in addition to what the women would have harvested for their own use. So there's a couple of questions, and I know I came in late and I'm not sure what time the Q&A is supposed to start. So I'll take a look at a few of these. I see Taylor Galvin mentioning in Broken Head Nation, they're working on a rice restoration project and is very encouraged by this discussion. And absolutely, I think food sovereignty, as he's raising, is really important in our communities. One of the things that residential schools caused is a break with our traditional, very healthy and very diverse, nutritional seasonal round. And so I think absolutely, I'm really glad to hear that you're working on bringing the rice back, Taylor, and I would love to, to hear more about that. And then I see Daniel has a question here saying each of the presenters spoke about conflict between settler states asserting water rights over Indigenous peoples and nations. Can Indigenous people ever really assert their rights and responsibilities without seeking recognition from those very states that continue to displace or deny those rights? And I think this is where the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People has been very significant. And I feel as well, now that essentially Canada has adopted that framework, it brings into question a different kind of seat at the table than we've had before. So it'll be interesting to see how this moves forward. I think having a seat on the Supreme Court is also really important here in Canada for Indigenous rights. But we really have to, and I think it is something that as we gradually educate Canada on all of our neighbors, everyone that we live among, the important understanding of these agreements, the important understanding of, hey, folks really were engaged in agriculture and we're not wandering aimlessly, skipping through the fields, as you sort of get from some of these very prejudicial early descriptions. I think that we'll increasingly have more and more voice in governing spaces, and that will lead us in a good way forward. Is it always going to be a struggle? Probably. And I don't think there will ever be a moment where we don't have to remind. But that's part of living together, is trying to have those conversations and working it forward. I think the more that we can create guidelines and expectations, the more that we can, as some communities have done, turn back to those documents and said, hey, actually, there's an elevator clause in this treaty. We should have had an increase in the amount of revenue we've been receiving. It shouldn't have been frozen in 1860. So I think a lot of those kinds of pieces bring us to a different place. So I don't know, I'm sort of hogging the conversation. I don't know if others want to jump in.
No, I want to, well, first of all, Cary, and I know jumping in when, things are kind of ongoing is not the easiest ask, but I have to say, despite all of that, what you just sort of shared with us spoke to and built on what Nicole and Teresa and Emma had already kind of brought to the table. So we've had a really kind of rich conversation that's kind of varied both like historically, but also geographically. And particularly kind of engaging where questions of kind of water and Indigenous waters and Indigenous ontologies and relationships connected to water and borders and particular colonial borders come into conversation and conflict. And so with that, I'll just say like a huge thank you, but also open it up for the three panelists that we still have with us. Dr. Norman had to step off the call, and there's some questions that were kind of specific to her. We'll make sure she gets them and we can follow up that way, but I'll open it up to the three speakers that we have on the call to see if they have any kind of questions for each other. And if you have one, just unmute and ask away.
Well, having missed the previous two talks, it's difficult for me to pose a question, so I'll leave it up to them.
I mean, I'm curious, and I think definitely kind of, both of you touched on this, but thinking about Indigenous peoples and borders, whether they're international or, within colonial states, we can talk about the problems and the violence of imposing those borders, but I'm also really interested in what the kind of transformative strategies are that Indigenous peoples are engaging in to transcend those borders. So curious to know, within the context that you're speaking about, what kind of innovative strategies you see people using.
Gosh, I'll be honest and I'll say I wish we had more trans-border conversations. Even recently I've talked with folks and I've said, hey, have you talked with, say, the language immersion Anishinaabe school at La Coudray? And folks are like, no, right? So I think there is a way in which that border really kind of doubled down on the isolation created through reserves, and in terms of holding people apart, people who annually were visiting, traveling, and interacting and sharing their knowledge and building that up. We've really gotten to a place where both Canada and the United States have engaged in policies intended to divide. And so part of our own decolonization is overcoming those divides. One of them is thinking, about our histories from the perspective of our nations, whether they are transborder or not. And so I just was an editor on the new edition of Indigenous Peoples Within Canada that just came out. And one of the things that I tried very consciously to do was to show the ways that, Anishinaabe history is a history that takes place on both sides of Lake Superior. Potawatomi history is something that takes place, in Lower Michigan and Lower Ontario. And so understanding these nations as nations and their actions as the actions of nations is really important, not only for having a real understanding of the history and the impact of colonialism, but also at reconnecting and rebuilding relationships. There are some communities that do this better than others. The Potawatomi actually have a Potawatomi gathering every summer at one of the 7 Potawatomi nations, which most are in the US, but there are a few on the Canadian side. And so that keeps them in touch. And it's a gathering in which, so certainly social and cultural connections are renewed, but they also very intentionally have workshops on what our governments are doing, how they're relating with the feds, how can we change the education system, how can we preserve our languages. So I think it's a very beautiful system that I would love to see more communities start to kind of, really push against the knowledge or the feeling that border is there, and think instead about who we are as nations and the knowledge that we have as nations that we can bring to bear to deal with common problems.
Thank you, Cary. I guess I'll add a little bit onto that. So within the Navajo Nation context, I think some of the more dynamic work that has been is actually around watersheds. Well, now you've met her over email, at least, Janine Yazzie, who hopefully will be meeting in person in New York at the water conference. Yeah, she co-founded the Little Colorado Watershed Association several years ago. And although her current work has now moved towards like the international platforms, and she has done remarkable water security for our Dene communities. And it was really through this idea of building partnerships amongst communities of a shared watershed. So because the Navajo Nation is so large, we also have our own political infighting amongst communities, which I would argue also stems from, these divisions across states, right? So we have different relationships with our own state governments. And so I think that also creates some differences in regards to water resources. So for instance, the Colorado Compact of 1922, which basically, divided, this imagined water pie amongst the 7 basin states, water that no longer physically exists, but on paper, people are still fighting over as we're reaching this so-called crisis point of this resource that millions of people rely upon in the Colorado River Basin. The over 30 basin tribal communities, most of them have not quantified their claims to the river. And the way it stands is, even though tribes have assured water rights through what's called the Winters Doctrine,
right.
In practice, that has meant tribes would have to secure water settlements through each of their states that crosses their boundaries. So for the Navajo Nation, that has meant, you have to do water settlements through the state of New Mexico, state of Utah, state of Arizona. So yeah, that's just another example of the imposition of settler boundaries and jurisdiction. But I think the Navajo Nation, I think is exceptional in this because we do cross so many different state boundaries.
Yeah. Have you been able to mobilize treatment as state status under the Clean Water Act?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
So-
we have, the Navajo Nation has its own EPA, and so a lot of what I was, before you joined, I was talking about some of the challenges of water security and regulation. It's not the fact that we don't have regulations. In fact, we have a very robust regulatory system, but it's because of what I argue is like this discontinuous allotment, because of like a legacy of allotment and checkerboarding across the Navajo Nation. So those parcels that do not have Navajo jurisdiction, therefore, are vulnerable to a regulatory lapse. So Navajo Nation wouldn't be able to regulate on like that,
right. Yeah, no.
200 feet or square mile or whatever it be. My research looks at those case studies of where those like jurisdictional islands exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Wisconsin, one of the communities there was able to use the treatment as state status to prevent a mine that would have poisoned a wild rice bed. And ultimately, certainly this was a struggle that went back and forth and through the courts and everything for about 20 years. But when the First Nations won, the mining consortium at that point sold them the rights. They bought the rights using casino profits for something like $6 million. I mean, it was pennies on the dollar because they knew they couldn't actualize it. And a couple of the communities in Wisconsin came together to purchase that. So there are ways that at the very least, treatment as state status has been effective to resist development projects that are not desired.
Yeah, or certainly purchasing land and then converting it into trust, but that creates another ethical, moral paradox, which is the tribes have to buy back their land that was stolen, and also for vastly more money than it would have taken, even if like for Navajo Nation. I mean, our treaty was signed relatively late, say in comparison to like Eastern tribes. So our treaty dates to 1868, but settlement was well into like the 20th century, and certainly with like the railroad that came in the late 19th century. So all of those things were chipping away at our tribal sovereignty.
Yeah, no question. And not only that, but then the conflicts with the settler towns nearby when you remove those lands from their tax base. The community in Sault Ste. Marie, again, back in the 90s, they wanted to expand the casino right at the edge of town. It meant buying some town commercial land, and there was significant resistance to that. And so they went to the feds. They got the feds to give them $2 bills, which are still legal tender, but not in circulation. And every single payout at the casino, they paid in $2 bills. And as those circulated through every till throughout the city, suddenly the Chamber of Commerce couldn't wait to allow them to put that land into federal trust. So it's I really like to celebrate the ways that we have developed to teach those we live among the value that we bring when we're allowed our sovereignty and when we're allowed to develop. But it's too bad we have to jump through so many hoops. The other piece, I know Black Mesa for a long time was a real drain on the resources of both the Navajo and Hopi nations with regard to water. But that's ended now, hasn't it?
Yeah, that ended a while ago. So yeah, that's in reference to the coal slurry,
right?
Which relied on it's called the sea aquifer or an aquifer, underneath Black Mesa, and that when you think about energy extraction, and I have colleagues who've written on this, Andrew Curley for one, he's got a new book coming out next month called Carbon Sovereignty. Look it up. But he looks at coal extraction in the Black Mesa region. And from his work, I've learned that also, that ties in very strongly to water extraction, because you needed the water not only for the slurry, but it was the coal power was actually to generate the transfer of water for Central Arizona project into Southern Arizona. So, natural resource extraction and extraction of water go hand in hand. Like these
100%
types of extraction, often can't be disaggregated. Thanks, Nicole, for posting.
Yeah, thank you both. This is fascinating. I did want to kind of, so you're mentioning what was it, the Little Colorado Basin. And one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of water and borders is something unique about this panel is that, I mean, people don't always talk about Indigenous people when they're talking about transboundary water. I mean, it seems ridiculous given everything we're talking about, but this idea of managing water at an ecological scale is really prominent in like colonial and non-Indigenous water governance. And so thinking about how watersheds can be borders and that are also socially constructed and can also be imposed on Indigenous peoples, because there's various scales within watersheds, and watersheds, like Indigenous territories, don't always follow the borders of watersheds. So it's an interesting kind of exercise for me to think about when Indigenous peoples are proposing these kind of watershed organizations as ways to kind of transcend borders. But there's a water governance scholar named a settler water governance scholar named Alice Cohen, who talks about them as an eco-scalar fix. So I think a lot of times kind of from a colonial perspective, we latch onto them as like, oh, this is going to fix our water management issues, but they can be equally problematic in terms of reinforcing colonial inequalities. Just something I thought of. Anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to draw attention that Taylor Galvin also noted in the chat sort of connections between the watershed kind of organizing and the work that the Amy Craft and Deborah McGregor have done around the NIBI gathering. And this year's NIBI gathering will be held, I think, there's the link there is in the chat. But you can follow up. It's going to be May 25th through the 28th. We also had a comment in the questions connecting kind of Monoman and wild rice regarding the sort of stop line 3 activism. So I think like all of these discussions have raised things that are kind of particular to the geographies you're most engaged with, but also kind of cut across them in all sorts of ways. And yeah, I just wanted, Teresa, there's one question here just that came across also from Taylor Galvin, and they write, Gitchi Miigwech, thank you for your presentation. Here in Manitoba, especially within our northern Cree communities, there's a lot of toxic landscapes where mining communities have come into our communities, contaminated the water, degraded ecosystems, and have caused health defects in wildlife and fish. I'm currently working on a toxic landscape project, and I was wondering, through your experience, what's the best way to approach mitigating these negative effects and holding the mining companies accountable? And it's a big question, but sometimes these questions of water and borders lead us right those questions. I wondered if you might speak to that, Teresa.
Sure. Well, okay, Taylor. Well, I guess the most obvious tool that we have for mitigating these toxic spills is, through litigation or lawsuits. Of course, that's not, I don't aspire to that as like that should be our only way. But certainly, and I'll speak to the Gold King mine spill case just because that's been ongoing. These things take years. So this was, 2015. That spill crossed across multiple state jurisdictions and tribal nations. So just last year, the EPA or federal government settled with the state of New Mexico, it settled with the state of Colorado, it settled with the state of Utah, and then it also settled with the Navajo Nation. And those were each individuals, even though I can't remember which configuration of states came together and they filed a suit. There were a number of individual tort claims that individual Navajo farmers filed with different firms. And it was actually, what do you call it, ambulance chasing, like those lawyers that go to places. So yeah, there was a number of law firms that were knocking on people's doors following the Gold King mine spill to try to get them to do a class action lawsuit. So I don't know where all of those stand. I will say what was interesting in the discourse surrounding Nicole King Minesville and a lot of the confusion that came from it is like, if the Navajo Nation was suing, what that would mean for individual farmers or individual communities. And those are different entities, right? So it's like the Navajo Nation did receive a settlement, which is going to be, last I heard, they would set up a fund, like a reserve fund that would be used for future remediation efforts. But it's up to the nation, right? I mean, they could technically do anything they want with that money. It could just go into like the general fund coffers. I don't know to what extent that would actually be paid out to individual communities. So those are the types of tensions I think that, confront tribal communities vis-a-vis its own government, right? Is like how the tribal government can mediate or manage the damages from the federal government and then pay out community, because once you divide up even like several $1 million, like that may not amount to much for individuals. So if you talk about remediation, I don't know if an individual farmer will actually feel that their harm has actually been remediated. So I know this is not a satisfactory question. I mean, there's other like forms of healing that actually have nothing to do with legality. But I think that's tribally or community specific. And I could just speak to different sorts of like prayers and ceremonies and ways that people have continued to come together. Reinstating farming practices, the sustenance of knowledge and whatnot. But in many ways, these are two different sorts of ways to try to remedy something that actually can't be fully remedied. Yet we try to find ways to endure.
Well, and I think it's also that, even the court procedures that allow us to file tort claims when we get a settlement, it's not always, there always seems to be a finger on the scale towards the companies. And I'm reminded, I don't know if Adele mentioned it or I can't remember. I used to teach Indigenous history in the United States for 15 years. And so one of the things that I would talk about was the cases regarding lung disease from the uranium mining down in your part of the world. And in terms of the compensation, the company said, sure, we'll pay compensation. Bring us your pay slip from 20 years ago that I'm sure you still have in a file somewhere, right? So the kinds of documentation that are demanded to show, you can't walk in with your medical record and just say, hey, you have to show that their mine caused it. And the ridiculousness of the paper trail that they expect the average person to keep is honestly obscene and shows their lack of commitment to true compensation.
On that note of both the power of these responses and their many locations and levels, and also to the limitations of some of them, I want to thank Dr. Norman, Dr. Miller, Dr. Montoya, Dr. Wilson for what was a really remarkable hour and a half of conversation. We will pass on the questions that Emma was not able to get to her, and we will sit with all of the many fine questions we got. We're grateful to the almost 80 people who joined us for this time. I want to thank Dr. Pauline Tennant, who has been critical to this and to everything that the Center for Human Rights Research does. There are some links in the chat that will connect you to some further events coming up. One is the last in the series that the UNAIG SDG group speaker series is running, and this is coming up with our colleague Annemieke Fahrenhorst, who will be talking about pesticides in water and wastewater and the prairie perspective. This on 20th of March. We have an event in our Methods in Medium series on what we're calling Thinking in Pictures, featuring Sean Carlton, Julia Smith, Gord Hill, and Kara Sievewright from the Graphic History Collective on the 15th of March. And we also have one last event in the Critical Conversation series, and that is a roundtable about transnationalism, resistance, gender, and identity as part of this discussion of borders. And that will be on the 31st of March at 11 a.m. And all of those links are in the chat. And so is additional information about all of our very distinguished speakers and their research that you can follow up with. And would also, of course, like to thank Shannon Hokinson and Christina Morden for their sign language interpretation, and everybody for their engagement, their attention, and their time, and their sharp and important thoughts on these questions of water and borders. So thank you very much.
So I saw people are talking about line 3. Also look at line 5. So I'll stop.
Okay. We could do a future line 5. There is so much more to say about all of these questions. But I'm glad that we've started this conversation, and I hope it goes on to live some other iterations. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day,
Thank
everybody.
you.